It's quite a surprising piece of history, almost paradoxical, really. England, the nation we often think of, leading the charge to abolish the slave trade later on, actually got into it pretty late, and frankly, through some very dubious means. Today, we're doing a deep dive into the very beginnings of European involvement in the transatlantic slave trade. We're focusing specifically on England's initial and, well, pretty illegal entry, led by John Hawkins and his voyages.
Exactly. And we've got some really compelling sources to shed light on these early days. We'll be looking at historical accounts that detail the roles Portugal and Spain were already playing, and then digging into the specifics of John Hawkins's expeditions, that famous ship, the Jesus of Lübeck, and the lasting impact of these events. We've got quotes from people back then and also from modern historians looking back.
Right. So our mission today, for you listening, is to really grasp how England went from being this latecomer, a legally questionable start, to eventually becoming such a dominant force in the slave trade. We're going to track the key figures, the main events that paved the way. Think of it as getting a crucial handle on a really significant, though obviously deeply troubling, period of history without getting totally overwhelmed by every single detail. So to understand England turning up late, where do we need to start? What's the backdrop?
Yeah, context is everything here. Before England even thought about it, Portugal was, well, the undisputed pioneer. They were the first European nation to really systematically get involved in trading enslaved Africans.
Yeah.
Initially, it was for labor back in Europe, but that shifted pretty dramatically to supplying labor for their sugar plantations in Brazil, big plantations. They set up this continuous large-scale system. They built forts along the coast, like Elmina Castle, to manage and control these routes.
Okay, so Portugal is in early, boots on the ground, operating on a massive scale. What about Spain? They were huge colonial powers in the Americas, too.
Absolutely. Spain, they created this enormous demand for enslaved labor, particularly in their Caribbean colonies. A lot of that demand came because the indigenous populations had just been decimated. You had the encomienda system, this incredibly brutal forced labor system, plus devastating European diseases. Indigenous numbers just plummeted. But interestingly, Spain mostly outsourced the actual buying and transporting of enslaved Africans. They mainly gave licenses, called the asiento, to others, especially the Portuguese, to supply them. And crucially, Spain had laws banning other foreign traders from their colonies. That's a really important point for understanding England's next move.
Right. Okay, so Spain needs the labor, Portugal's got the established supply chain, and England's kind of locked out by Spanish law. This is where John Hawkins comes in, I assume. Tell us a bit about him.
It's exactly. John Hawkins, he was an English merchant, a privateer as well, from a well-known seafaring family in Plymouth. Privateering back then, it was a bit of a gray area, wasn't it? Somewhere between state-approved raiding and, well, piracy. Hawkins definitely saw an opportunity. He saw the Spanish colonies, saw that unmet demand for labor, and figured he could make a profit despite that Spanish ban. He operated in that sort of ambiguous space.
And he had quite the ship for this, the Jesus of Lübeck. The name itself is, well, deeply ironic given its purpose.
It really is. The Jesus of Lübeck was actually a German-built ship, a large carrack from Lübeck, hence the name. It wasn't built for the slave trade at all. Originally, it was for general trade, maybe even warfare. What's really striking, though, is who owned it. King Henry VIII initially. And then, for Hawkins' voyages in the 1560s, it was actually loaned to him by Queen Elizabeth I.
Wow, wait, loaned by the Queen herself, the Queen's ship.
Yes, which tells you something about the level of official, if perhaps deniable, backing. It was huge for its time, about 700 tons, heavily armed, a very formidable vessel for crossing the Atlantic.
That crown involvement is really significant. So what did this first voyage, Hawkins' first attempt, actually look like?
Okay, so October 1562. Hawkins set sail. He's got 4 ships. Jesus of Lübeck is the flagship, then the Solomon, Tiger, and Swallow. About 100 men in total. The mission, however grim it sounds to us now, was very clear in their minds. Get enslaved Africans, sail them across the Atlantic, and sell them for a profit in the Spanish Caribbean. They headed first for the West African coast, places like Sierra Leone and Guinea.
And the acquiring of these people, how did that happen? Was it purely trade?
Not at all. The accounts we have are quite stark. Hawkins and his crews, they raided villages, they engaged in outright kidnapping, they also purchased some enslaved people from African traders who were already involved in existing systems of enslavement. In the end, they forcibly loaded somewhere between, say, 300 and 400 people onto their ships.
And then came the Middle Passage.
Then came the Middle Passage. The horrors of that journey are almost impossible to truly convey. We're talking extreme overcrowding, rampant disease, almost no sanitation, dehydration, starvation, constant violence and abuse, both physical and psychological. It's
Ugh.
unimaginable suffering.
It's hard to even think about. And when he finally reached the Caribbean, he still had that Spanish ban to deal with. How did he manage to actually sell the people he brought?
Right. The ban was technically still in place, but Hawkins seems to have used a combination of, well, threats, deception, and probably bribery. He essentially forced local Spanish officials and colonists to trade with him. He managed to sell the captive Africans in places like Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and parts of Cuba, and he traded them for valuable colonial goods, sugar, animal hides, ginger, even pearls.
So despite the risks, despite the illegality, it worked out for him financially.
Oh, yes. Despite some storms and difficulties on the way back, Hawkins returned to England in mid-1563, having made a very significant profit. He was apparently hailed as something of a national figure. This first voyage, it really demonstrated the sheer potential for profit. That was the key takeaway that would fuel England's later, much larger
A
involvement.
national hero for kidnapping and selling people. It's a really chilling thought looking back. So what was the immediate fallout, the impact of just this one voyage? It wasn't just about Hawkins' personal gain, right?
No, definitely not. That 1562 voyage is really seen by historians as the moment England formally, albeit illegally, entered the transatlantic slave trade. It set a precedent, it showed it could be done, and crucially, that it could be incredibly profitable. And as we mentioned, Queen Elizabeth I's support was vital, loaning him the Jesus of Lübeck, investing in his later voyages. Even if she reportedly expressed some discomfort later, it gave the whole enterprise a kind of legitimacy among the English elite.
And I imagine the Spanish weren't too pleased about an Englishman forcing his way into their colonies.
Not pleased at all. Hawkins' activities were a direct violation of their laws and a challenge to their control. It significantly soured relations between England and Spain. These kinds of provocations definitely contributed to the rising tensions that eventually led to open conflict, like the Anglo-Spanish War and, the famous Armada.
So big geopolitical consequences. But what about the methods themselves? Did Hawkins' approach have a longer-term impact on how the trade was conducted?
Tragically, yes. The brutal methods Hawkins used, the village raids, the kidnapping, the deception in trade, the utter disregard for human life during the Middle Passage, these unfortunately became pretty standard practices within the English slave trade as it developed. He essentially showed English merchants and sailors how vast profits could be wrung from this horrific exploitation. He sort of opened the door.
It's vital we understand how people back then justified this to themselves and to others. We have some direct accounts, don't we?
We do, and they are quite revealing. In Hawkins' own journal from that first voyage of 1562, he wrote something quite telling after selling the enslaved people. He mentioned the Spanish were content to buy the Negroes that I had with me, and then added, whereby I thought I might do God good service in bringing them to Christianity.
Bringing them to Christianity through kidnapping and brutal enslavement.
Exactly. It's a classic justification used throughout the colonial era, isn't it? Using religion to somehow sanitize or mask the appalling reality of what was actually happening.
And then there was Richard Hakluyt, who was basically compiling stories of English exploration. How did he frame Hawkins's voyages?
Hakluyt was hugely influential in promoting English expansion overseas. In his major work, The Principal Navigations, published in 1589, he included Hawkins's voyages. He presented them almost as heroic national achievements. He wrote that Hawkins made 3 notable voyages with great gain and honor to himself and credit to his country. It's a clear example of, writing history to serve a national narrative, emphasizing the profit and the supposed glory, while completely glossing over the violence and suffering involved.
And wasn't there something quite graphic about Hawkins's own coat of arms?
Yes, that's another stark piece of evidence. After his second slaving voyage, Hawkins was granted a coat of arms by the crown. And for his crest, the bit at the top, he chose to include a demi-Moor bound and captive. So the upper half of a black African man explicitly shown as tied up and enslaved.
Wow. So it wasn't hidden, it was right there, displayed as part of his official identity.
Exactly. The fact that this symbol, representing human bondage, was perfectly acceptable, even perhaps celebrated, among the English elite, tells you a lot about the attitudes towards slavery at the time. It was being normalized.
These contemporary sources paint a pretty grim picture of the mindset. How do modern historians interpret Hawkins and these early voyages now?
Modern historians offer essential perspectives, obviously free from the biases and justifications of the time. David Olusoga, for instance, puts it very clearly. He says, Hawkins did not invent the transatlantic slave trade, but he gave England its first taste of the wealth it would generate. He really stresses how foundational these voyages were for building British wealth.
So it wasn't the invention, but the English entry point to the profits.
Precisely. And James Walvin, another key historian in this field, talks about the shift Hawkins caused within England. Walvin argues the voyage of 1562 was a turning point. Hawkins showed the English that profit could be made from Africa and from Africans. He highlights how Hawkins helped to normalize exploiting people specifically for profit within that English maritime world.
And there was one more perspective, focusing on the Jesus of Lübeck itself.
Yes, Stephen Utcherwood, writing about the ship and the voyages, summed it up quite concisely. He described Hawkins's expeditions as a mixture of piracy, trade, and diplomacy with human lives as the currency. I think that really captures the ethically murky and ultimately brutal reality. Human beings treated purely as commodities in this game of profit and power politics.
Okay, so let's try and pull these threads together. If we're summarizing the key takeaways from this deep dive into England's entry into the slave trade, what stands out?
Well, first, Portugal got there early, setting up a large, systematic trade. Spain created huge demand in their colonies, but mostly relied on others, like the Portuguese, for the supply via the asiento. Then comes England, quite late to the party, with John Hawkins leading the charge. His entry was illegal under Spanish law, marked by violence, kidnapping, raiding, and deception. But crucially, despite how morally bankrupt it was, this venture got support from the very top, from Queen Elizabeth I, and it proved incredibly profitable, which essentially normalized the slave trade as a viable, even desirable business for England, setting the stage for its massive expansion later on.
And really understanding these uncomfortable beginnings gives us such important context, doesn't it, for understanding the sheer scale of what followed, the impact of the trade, and the legacies we're still dealing with today.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront that long, tangled relationship between the pursuit of profit, the exercise of power, and the exploitation of human beings.
Yeah.
How did people and nations justify these horrific actions back then, all in the name of economic gain? And maybe the final thought for you to consider is, what echoes of that history justifying questionable actions for profit or power can we still see playing out in the world around us today?